One of the things that's key to understand about personality and personality traits is really there's no such thing as good or bad. The reason evolution gave us all of these different traits and why people are so different and we have this range of personalities is because they're all useful to a degree. And there will always be situations where a particular personality trait comes in handy.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Today it's Alex and we're going to be talking about this idea of conflict. What's the difference between healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict? And we're going to be diving into that via the agreeableness personality trait. So one question to start off is, why is conflict important in relationships? And isn't it generally better to keep the peace, so to speak? A lot of times in our culture, conflict is seen unconsciously as some kind of problem which needs to be avoided. And at any time, again, societally, it's kind of taboo for people to have conflict between each other, especially in public. And generally, conflict is seen as a sign that things are going wrong between the two people, things are going wrong in the relationship. Often in TV shows and films, conflict is portrayed as a negative thing, and generally in TV shows and films, it's really unhealthy conflict that's being portrayed, conflict that's destructive. So it's very important, one of the most important distinctions we'll make today is between healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict. Okay, so firstly, we're going to talk about how you should think about conflict, how you should conceptualize it. And then we'll talk about how do you actually have the conflict in a really practical sense. How do you have conflict that's healthy with a person that you're in relationship with? And that can be a romantic partner, family member, a friend, even a colleague or a co-worker. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about inner conflict within each individual, because that's a very important area within psychological health as well. And inner conflicts can often expose areas of important growth for people. Okay, so firstly, how should you think about conflict? Conflict is important because it's the process by which you and another person that you're in a relationship with can establish yourselves as individuals within relationship. This is kind of the difference between codependence and interdependence. Codependence is when people are in an unhealthy way dependent on each other, sometimes even in a morbid way. And interdependence is two people who are fundamentally independent, but they are established in a relationship with each other such that they're greater than the sum of their parts. And generally, the ideal that you should be moving towards in a relationship is this idea of interdependence, which doesn't mean, of course, that you can't have moments of codependence, that it's going to be perfect always, and you don't always need the person that you're in a relationship with. But you can think of it as an ideal that you can be striving towards. Healthy conflict is an essential means of making your needs and boundaries known to another person. And it's often only when we start to relate to another person deeply and intimately that we realize what our values are, what our needs are, what makes us individuals, what makes our personality unique. Am I a really orderly person? Am I really a messy person? Am I a sensitive person? Am I a creative person? These are things we often only find out once we're actually relating to another person and we can compare and contrast our personality with their personality. And then you realize, oh, I'm kind of like this. I'm kind of more of a scatterbrained person. I'm interested in lots of different things. My partner's more kind of interested in just a couple of things. Or I'm kind of a neat person. I like things particularly organized. My partner is more comfortable with mess. And of course, the big personality trait that conflict centers around is the agreeableness personality trait. So in the Big Five model of personality, which is one of the most empirical models of personality we have, there are 5 traits, and one of them is agreeableness. And you can think about it as everyone exists somewhere on a spectrum of agreeableness, with people who are very agreeable at one end and people who are very disagreeable at the other end. People who are very agreeable tend to be very compassionate and very polite. Those are the two subdomains of agreeableness. And people who are very disagreeable are the opposite, of course. And most people exist somewhere in between. So people who are very agreeable, they tend to really value empathy, taking the other person's position on, social harmony, making sure the waters are very smooth, making sure everyone's getting along, both in relationships between two people but also in groups. And they would have a tendency to submit their own needs and desires in favor of the needs of the other person or in favor of the needs of the group. Whereas disagreeable people are much more ready at a moment's notice to prioritize themselves over another person or over the group. And they're much more ready to have conflict in order to facilitate that. Now, it's really important, one of the things that's key to understand about personality and personality traits is really there's no such thing as good or bad. The reason evolution gave us all of these different traits and why people are so different and we have this range of personalities is because they're all useful to a degree. And there will always be situations where a particular personality trait comes in handy. And really what you should do as an individual is to try and discover what are your predilections, what are your personality traits, your particular strengths and weaknesses. Realize in what situations they're serving you and in what situations they're not. Try and construct a life that really plays to your strengths and doesn't exploit your weaknesses. And then slowly over time, see if you can build a more dynamic personality. See if you can actually develop and cultivate personality traits which you don't have naturally. So if you're very agreeable, as we'll talk about in this particular podcast, it makes sense to cultivate some disagreeableness, some willingness to have conflict. If on the other hand you're very disagreeable, it would make sense to cultivate more empathy and understanding of the other person and more willingness to have social harmony. The reason why I'm centering this podcast around healthy conflict and about agreeable people learning to be more disagreeable is because I just think it's very, very common, particularly in Western society, which is often very emotionally avoidant and as a consequence, very conflict avoidant. Many people are starting to find that they have a lack of assertiveness skills and healthy conflict skills. And as I said before, there's kind of a taboo around conflict in our society. And a very common reason why people go to psychotherapy is to learn assertiveness skills, conflict skills, as a means, as a gateway, really to become their own person. Because you won't really be able to establish yourself as an individual in the world or in relationship to another person or in relationship to a group if you don't have these healthy conflict skills. Another issue worth pointing out is that people often have the notion, and again this might be an unconscious notion, and they may have gotten this from their family or from their culture, that to be good in a moral sense, means to sacrifice your needs and wants for other people, essentially to be a martyr. And often people who have this predilection end up in relationship with people who are very disagreeable. And as I said before, disagreeable people are much more willing to prioritize themselves over other people. Sometimes these people are full-blown narcissists. And so you can see how there's this polarity that can develop between people who are very agreeable and people who are very disagreeable. It's this polarity that can often create an attraction between people, again, both in romantic relationships and in friendships. And some degree of polarity is okay. If you have two people in a couple, one is likely to be somewhat more disagreeable than the other person. But the key distinction is this a couple where both people are getting their needs and wants met? And if there's a reasonable degree of polarity, that can absolutely happen. Just because one person is a bit more agreeable than the other, the agreeable person can still get their needs and wants met. But the more of an extreme difference there is, and an extreme polarity, the more likely it is that it's actually a relationship where the disagreeable person may actually be taking advantage of the agreeable person, and one person in the relationship is being exploited. An example of this is the relationship in Marriage Story. Last year on Valentine's Day, we released an analysis on the movie Marriage Story, if you want to go back and look at that. And that was one of the issues in the relationship between that couple, between Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver, is Adam Driver was quite a self-oriented person, not necessarily full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, but quite a self-oriented person. And Scarlett Johansson kind of submitted to herself to him for a long time, until she eventually realized just how much she wasn't living her own life. And that's one of the factors which precipitated their divorce in the film. So again, some polarity is okay and can create healthy attraction. But the key is, are both people in the relationship getting their needs, their wants, their desires met or not? What's the difference between healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict? I think essentially the difference is, even though it's counterintuitive, healthy conflict should essentially be coming from a place of vulnerability, by which I mean healthy conflict is coming from a place of really identifying what you need and want out of a situation. It's about you. It's about you realizing that your partner is doing something which is somehow infringing on your needs and wants and desires, or they're not doing something that you need, want, or desire, and you'd like to make that a reality, and then conflict is the vehicle you can use to make that happen. Unhealthy conflict is not coming from a place of vulnerability, but actually unhealthy conflict is a defense against vulnerability, and it's using aggression to make the person being aggressive feel okay by making the person that's being targeted feel not okay, by pointing out what's wrong with them. Healthy conflict is usually specific, pointing out a specific issue that you have, whereas unhealthy conflict tends to be more of a global attack on the other person, saying they're a bad person or a bad partner or a bad friend. Often unhealthy conflict comes with a large degree of moral judgment, telling them they're really in the wrong in some deep sense, in an irrevocable sense. Whereas healthy conflict is coming from the place of accepting the other person, as the person that they are, but asking that some kind of change be made. Unhealthy conflict often involves a wish to control the other person or a wish to humiliate the other person. And again, healthy conflict is simply a way of trying to get something that you want that's important to you, or to stop something that's happening that you feel is harming you in some way. Although conflict is always going to be unpleasant, it's actually a path to intimacy, because intimacy is the two people in a relationship getting to know each other fundamentally. That's what creates intimacy. And there's no way you can have that without conflict. Conflict is the pathway you take to actually getting to know both yourself and the other person. By just trying to maintain this illusion of harmony between the two of you, actually what you're doing is perpetuating a fantasy. And that's going to be a major intimacy blocker. And intimacy is really the lifeblood of a relationship, particularly in the long term. That's what will make the difference between a relationship which is successful and not successful. Another way to think about it is, if you're avoiding conflict with your partner, you're essentially shielding them from the reality of who you are. And it allows all of these unhelpful assumptions and sometimes these full-blown fantasies about each other to take hold. To give the devil its due, I do think avoiding conflict can be a useful short-term strategy. There are specific situations, if you're in public or someone's going through a particularly difficult time or whatever the circumstance may be, avoiding conflict may be a useful short-term strategy. but in the long term, it will result in the deterioration of the health of the relationship. Because when conflict is avoided, it causes a build-up of resentment. Resentment is a relationship killer. There's only so much resentment a relationship can tolerate. You can think about it as deadwood accumulating in a forest. The more deadwood builds up, and this actually happens in forests where humans intervene by actually putting out fires, what happens, ironically, is that deadwood builds up, and that increases the chance that at any moment the forest could just go completely ablaze. So resentment is like the deadwood in your relationship. There's only a certain amount that it can tolerate. Ultimately, healthy conflict is a way of clearing up this deadwood, this resentment in the relationship. Understand that it's a process that needs to happen regularly for this to occur. One final way to think about it is you need to have small conflicts earlier to avoid large conflicts later down the road. If your partner does something which annoys you today, it'll be far easier to talk about it today than to talk about it in 10 years when the behavior has all that time to fester and get worse in your own mind, and that's all the more time for that crippling resentment to build up, as we talked about earlier. So even if you are coming at this from a space of I don't really like conflict, I find conflict unpleasant, which is fair enough, it will actually save you having to have more conflict in the long run if you're willing to assert your boundaries earlier over a given issue or over a given situation. So all of that being said, we've discussed a few ways how to think about conflict, and I've presented an argument of why healthy conflict is important. Next, let's talk about how do you actually have the conflict, some practical stuff. Firstly, it's important to have a clear idea of what you care about and what you don't care about, what your actual values, needs, and desires are. And you'll discover this through a combination of living life, having lots of different experiences, having lots of different relationships with people, romantic relationships, friendships, co-working relationships, and also being regularly introspective. Something we advocate a lot on the podcast is have some kind of introspective practice that you do, and that could be therapy, but it doesn't have to be therapy. It could be something as simple as keeping a journal. It could be something like meditation. It could be something as simple as having regular, sincere discussions with people in your life where you really just try and figure out what you authentically think about something. So the combination of having that regular introspective practice and actually having experiences engaging with life, through the combination of those two, you're going to start to discover what your values are. And really, it's important to know at least what you don't care about, what isn't such a big issue, because that's going to be far more things. And then there'll be a few things, your non-negotiables, which you really do care about. So before you even think about having a conflict, you need to think about what is it that actually is being infringed upon, or what am I after in this situation. And you should also be aware that it might take the process of having conflict to clarify some of that. So it's not like you need to know everything, every single detail about what you want or what annoyed you. And in fact, the process of dialogue through conflict can help to make a low resolution idea, a low resolution issue for you, more high resolution. But before you start, you at least want to have some idea of where you're coming from, of what's important to you. And in addition to that, it's important to be mindful of what emotions these issues are bringing up. Emotions are really going to be the red flags which start this whole process. When you're dealing with someone, what is it that they do that makes you feel anxious, or sad, or afraid, or angry? Those emotions are going to be the initial signals from your body and mind that something isn't quite right. And rarely, maybe if you've had a history of trauma, it could actually trigger something more dissociative, where you actually feel kind of numb and you feel your emotions actually being suppressed and you feel kind of withdrawn. So that can be an important signal as well. One really simple, really useful model of healthy conflict is found in the book The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. in which one of the habits that's described is seek first to understand and then to be understood. So what you would do with this model is first try your very best to understand your partner's position on an issue as clearly and as specifically as you can, to the point where you can actually state their argument back to them in a way that they would agree with. So rather than being defensive, trying to put your own values, your own assumptions on your partner's position, you're really just trying to get into their head. You're using empathy to understand their point of view, their frame of reference as clearly as possible. And then you allow them to undergo the same process with you. The huge advantage of this approach is that it circumvents all the assumptions and fantasies that we create about the other person or that the other person creates about us, which can really turn a healthy conflict into an unhealthy conflict. Again, this is often the product of avoiding conflict, is we make all these assumptions in our head about what the conflict is about, what the other person thinks or feels. So by seeking first to understand and then to be understood, you are clarifying your position and your partner's position such that you have a very solid space from which to work, from which to negotiate. You want to think about using the minimum necessary aggression to achieve a specific goal. So if you'd like your partner to start doing a particular behavior or stop doing a particular behavior, what's the smallest amount of aggression necessary in order to achieve that? How can you manifest your aggression in a way that's reasonable and healthy? You need to be mindful of your non-verbal communication first. Eye contact is important when you're trying to be assertive. You need to maintain steady eye contact. You might speak in brief, short sentences which are direct and to the point, again, without being unnecessarily mean, defensive, or attacking. But by using short, to the point sentences, you're indicating that you're taking this with a high level of seriousness. And then your vocal tone is important as well. There are basically 3 ways your vocal tone can be: upgoing, neutral, or downgoing. So upgoing is more for like asking a question. So if I asked, what time is it? You can hear my tone going up. If I said, what time is it? That's a neutral vocal tone. Or if I said, what time is it? That's a vocal tone going down. And when you want to be a little bit more aggressive and assertive, you want to have a downgoing vocal tone. So you might say, I really need you to stop doing that, rather than, I really need you to stop doing that. The first one, as you can hear intuitively, has a lot more power behind it. So be mindful of your eye contact, your body language, your vocal tone, that's the non-verbal. And then with what you actually say, keep it short, keep it direct, without being mean or unnecessarily attacking. And in terms of the content of what you say, the actual words, again, be as specific as possible. If you're annoyed because your partner doesn't do the dishes as often as you'd like, don't tell them that they're a terrible partner. Tell them, listen, I'm really unhappy with the way we divide the dishes and I'd really like you to do the dishes more. And if you did that, I'd be a lot happier. So you keep it very, very specific to the micro situation rather than making it about the whole relationship. In this way, conflict is able to happen within an atmosphere of basic safety. And it might be unpleasant, but it doesn't have to pose an existential threat to the relationship. Now, obviously, this gets complicated, especially in relationships which have avoided conflict for a long time. Something relatively small can all of a sudden trigger an existential threat. And of course, it's also possible that whatever it is you're fighting about is an existential threat. Say you're fighting about whether we want children or don't want children, or where do we want to live, or what are the core values we want to abide by. These are big issues, and to some degree you have to be open to the possibility that a given conflict could be an existential threat to the relationship. But in general, when you're just thinking about conflict as maintaining the relationships, you're happy with it, you want it to continue, but conflict is this maintenance process. Keep it small and specific and within that general atmosphere of safety and acceptance. using the minimum necessary force to protect, what you care about and what you value. And the last thing I want to talk about is internal conflict within yourself. In psychoanalysis, this is called intrapsychic conflict. And this is very important. The first thing to accept, of course, is the idea that you're not one thing. You're composed of lots of different forces, biological forces, psychological, internalized societal drives. And to some degree or another, you exist in relationship to yourself. And at first, this seems a bit counterintuitive. You think of yourself as just one thing. But when you think about it, you do have to speak to yourself, discipline yourself, allow yourself to let go. You have internal dialogue all the time. So you really are in relationship to yourself, and often different parts of yourself become opposed to each other, and that's very common and very normal. And that's this internal conflict. People usually don't like it when they discover internal conflict, and they tend to suppress it. Another phrase for this is called cognitive dissonance. When, for example, you have two beliefs in your head which contradict each other, two beliefs you really care about which contradict each other, or when your beliefs and your behavior contradict each other. Say you're aware that smoking is bad for you, but you're smoking anyway. And that causes this really unpleasant feeling of conflict and cognitive dissonance. And because it's really unpleasant, just like in conflict with relationships, our first reaction is often to sweep it out under the rug. And this is a mistake. Just like you can't allow resentment to build up in relationships, you can't allow internal conflict to build up within yourself. It's very psychologically unhealthy, and ultimately it will always go down quite a bad road. There's only so much internal conflict that a person can have at any given time. Just like resentment, you have to decide what's your conflict budget going to be. So when you start to detect these conflicts in yourself, and again, obviously introspective processes are really helpful because this is all internal, you want to start to iron them out. You really, the mark of a well-integrated, psychologically healthy person is the ability to marshal the different aspects of themselves to be rowing in the same direction. So your different emotions, ideally to be pointing towards the same goal, and your thoughts, and your beliefs, and your behaviors. Now again, this is an ideal to be striving towards. No one's free of conflict, no one's perfectly integrated, but you want to keep it in your mind as a target you should be striving towards. So again, going back to the cigarette example, if you have a conflict between your beliefs and your behavior around cigarettes, it might pay you to examine that conflict and to see if you can get things flowing in the same direction. So in this case, changing your behavior so that you stop smoking, and your behavior is now aligned with your beliefs. You believe that smoking is bad for you, and your behavior is aligned with that belief. If you want a full deep dive into how to change your behavior, you can look at our last audio essay, which we released in January, which is all about how to change your behavior in the long term. It's a step-by-step how-to guide for that. Another kind of conflict might be you want emotional intimacy, you want to get close to someone, but you're afraid of being rejected, which is it's a common one, but it's a little bit more complicated. And then you might have to decide, for example, that you're worth risking the rejection in order to seek the intimacy, because ultimately intimacy is more important to you than just avoiding pain. That's a decision you could make. You could make the opposite decision. Ultimately, these are decisions every person has to make based on those values. But the overall point is, conflict does warrant some examination and some thought, some bringing into consciousness. And if it's not, then it tends to fester and to cause more psychological problems further down the line. Another conflict might be you want to spend time with people, but because you've spent a lot of time in isolation during COVID, you've now developed social anxiety. So you have the deep desire and emotion that pulls you towards other people, but then you have another emotion, fear and anxiety, which is preventing you, which is blocking you towards reaching that goal. And in that case, the fear and the anxiety is not an emotion that's helping you. And through exposure and desensitization, you can realize that actually that's a fear that can be overcome. So that's another conflict that you could think about ironing out. And then one final example is there conflict between your internal value system and how you live your life? And really, this is the essence of what integrity is. Do you, for example, believe that honesty is the best policy, but you find yourself lying all the time? Do you believe that gossiping is essentially a bad thing, but you find yourself talking behind people's backs? This again is another kind of conflict, or another word for it is incongruence. And again, these kinds of incongruences, they put you in a weak position because you're more scattered, you're less unified in some sense. So in summary, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about why conflict is important, the difference between healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict, a little bit about the practicalities of engaging in conflict with someone, how to make that conflict healthy, using your non-verbals and your verbals, and also a bit about internal conflict that can arise between your beliefs and your emotions and your behavior, between your internal values and what you actually do in the world, and how important it is to try and iron that out and to be a more integrated and psychologically healthy person. I hope you found that useful. As always, would love to hear the feedback. Email us about situations you've been in, conflicts you've had, how you've tackled them. Would be really interested to know. And we'll see you here again next time.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend or give us a rating. It really does help people to find us. If you find the podcast valuable, why not buy us a coffee to help keep us going? There's a link in the show notes. As ever, we love to hear from you and love to hear what you think. So drop us an email or get in touch on social media. Thank you so much.